Welcome back, everybody. I hope you managed to get some of those pesky emails out the way, and you're ready to settle back down for a fascinating couple of hours in this next set of sessions of the Beyond Multiple Choice Conference. I'm going to, in a moment, hand over to Brian Moon from Sero, who's going to give us a brief demonstration on concept mapping, which has already had a couple of mentions at this conference. Then I'll be back to introduce another one of my colleagues, Christine Hadid, who will chair the session 2 this afternoon. And then we'll be back for the final question and answer panel of the afternoon, chaired by Martyn Roads, with a good lineup of panelists for that too. Remember, please use the chat room. We welcome your comments and questions. It's your conference, really. Make it as interactive as you want. There's been some really nice feedback as well today, and we appreciate that people really enjoyed this morning's sessions. So I think without further ado, please step forward, Brian Moon, and we'll carry on with his special session demonstration on concept mapping. Over to you, Brian, and I'll be back in about 20 minutes or so.
Thank you, Jeff. For those who have been watching us closely over the past couple of weeks, and especially the agenda, you will realize that this is wasn't the anticipated session. We actually had someone who unfortunately was ill today and couldn't present. So we switched up the agenda a bit, and I'm going to give this talk, which was going to be set aside for Thursday. I'm going to give this talk now, and then on Thursday, actually kind of show you a bit more about what we're doing with Sero and concept mapping. But today, we really just I want to introduce you to concept mapping. As Jeff noted, concept maps and concept mapping has been mentioned already. This morning, Ian, who's a colleague from the concept mapping community, but obviously has a lot more to say about universities and how they work, or at times don't, gave us a great keynote. And so he mentioned his interest in concept mapping, and I'm going to take a step back from his talk and just introduce folks more broadly to concept mapping. I am your co-host for this event this week, also the president of Sero Learning Assessments and Pedagogy and Technologies. But with regard to concept mapping, I'm also the co-author of Applied Concept Mapping, Capturing and Analyzing and Organizing Knowledge, which I wrote with Joe Novak and others who were pioneers in concept mapping. Today, I just want to, like I said, take a step back, introduce folks more broadly to concept mapping and concept maps, and talk about why they're such a great learning and assessment tool. Distinguish them a bit from other diagramming tools that you might be familiar with, such as mind maps. Talk a bit about what goes into creating a good concept map, and then get into the leverage piece. How can you leverage concept mapping in a learning environment? So why are concept maps such a great learning and assessment tool? Just to provide a bit of background, concept mapping came out of the work of Joe Novak and his team in the early 70s at Cornell. That's almost 50 years ago, actually, that concept mapping was originally conceived as really as an analysis tool. The origins of concept mapping fall into trying to create a tool to more efficiently assess the mental models and the changing knowledge structures that students of biology had. And the story goes that Joe and his colleagues, they were trying all sorts of ways to try to understand how those structures were changing with children. And so that meant engaging children in different ways. They were doing a lot of interviewing and kind of realized that that was a very bulky, very inefficient way to get at those knowledge structures. And they also couldn't see them change very well over time. So concept mapping was actually an analysis tool, a notation tool to help them interview and help them analyze their interview notes. And so from that perspective, you can think of concept mapping as being an analysis tool to help the educators to really understand and see those changes. Since then, of course, there's been lots and lots of studies that demonstrate the cognitive benefits of concept mapping for the learner themselves, of course, and then using them as an assessment tool has been the focus for a number of programs, both at the academic level in terms of developing different assessment strategies using concept mapping, and also on the education and governing level. So many of you may be familiar with the National Assessment of Educational Progress here in the US. The science framework has actually called for having concept mapping as an interactive computer task since 2009. It hasn't been implemented widely or even pilot tested. And so there's always hope that that might happen. But just goes to show you sort of how far we've come from this initial idea of really trying to capture as an analysis tool, capture those changing structures in children to what we now have, which is a very mature and well-researched approach. Concept maps portray mental models using meaningful diagrams and knowledge. So let's break that down a bit. So we can think of mental models as the tools that we have in our head to help us process information, predict outcomes, make sense of the world. And so those mental models can also reveal expert decision-making strategies. That's what I actually do in a lot of my professional work, is work with experts in various domains to help them build concept maps as a way to externalize that mental model. But for learners of all ages and professionals, they can create those cognitive connections to help us make sense of the world. We think of them as a peak, and I like the discussion earlier about the Polaroid pictures, really a snapshot, if you will. And Ian, I think, showed us really how that snapshot can, of course, change over time. But what we like about concept mapping is that they are a nice snapshot. They're at a glance, you can see what a student knows. You can see if you're interested in sort of customer perceptions of a product or service. You can see how experts think about certain problems, and how different team members have shared or perhaps not shared parts of their mental models. And so these are just a number of ways that concept mapping and concept maps have been applied. And because they can allow this access, because they can help us externalize the mental models that we otherwise can't share with others very well, they're a very powerful learning and assessment tool. Part of the program that Joe and his colleagues were working through was to try to operationalize, if you will, this idea of meaningful learning. And so this is David Ausubel's work. And the idea behind meaningful learning is that you can assimilate new information within the context of what you already know. And so that's this prior knowledge that makes new knowledge relevant or meaningful to a learner. And so as an operational idea for how to realize this sort of thing, Joe and his colleagues kind of realized that they could use the concept maps as the way to sort of get at what is that current mental model or that current knowledge structure. Ian talked this morning about sort of assessment of and assessment for learning. Concept mapping, I believe, can be both. So if you are going to teach from what a student knows, of course, you need some access to what that student knows, and concept mapping can be a useful way of doing that. I cheated a bit on my slides here because after Ian's talk, I also wanted to add a rhizome here because I didn't just want to have a tree, but more importantly, what concept mapping can do is reveal that prior knowledge in a number of ways, but it can also reveal prior knowledge that's applicable in different ways. And so we're not just looking for, do you know this set of facts about this particular problem, but it can also be an indicator about your prior knowledge that might be applicable across a number of topics or a number of applications. And so as an evaluation of the before, right? Because we're trying to understand again where the students are. And when you have classrooms of 30, 50 or more students, trying to get that understanding across all those students, sort of where they're starting from, can of course be a challenge. So that's one way that concept mapping can be useful. We often compare concept mapping and meaningful learning to rote learning. And here's just a simple diagram of what that means. So rote learning is going to call for students, for instance, to memorize the outcome of certain landmark Supreme Court verdicts, right? So organize and learn the facts about those events. Whereas meaningful learning ideally is enabling those students to connect those kinds of outcomes, prior cases, to current policies and events today. So to really draw those connections between what's known and what can be imagined or what can be extrapolated from what's known. So concept mapping is, to get back to Ian's talk, is not a linear approach to learning. It's really about sort of understanding holistically how different ideas tie together. Again, so meaningful mental modeling is kind of how you can think about concept mapping. What we find in particular to be useful is not only for people to develop their own models, but to view representation of others' mental models. One of our earlier talks also was about kind of peer review and having students review the work of others in order to understand where they're different and to provide critiques and to provide feedback. You can do the same thing with concept maps. And so that process of engaging with maps, whether they're your own that you're building or others that have been created or the teacher or the expert model, our view is that this interactive process with concept mapping can again enable you to achieve that holistic understanding of kind of a bigger picture than just the facts. So I want to be clear about what we mean by concept mapping as opposed to mind maps. And so we often hear, especially as we're showing our work, oh, you're doing mind maps. And so we're very quick to correct folks, because mind mapping and the idea of sort of organizing, but with boxes and lines, is out there as a tool that can be used for a couple of different applications. The difference being with concept maps, I'm actually going to dive a bit deeper here, is that as opposed to just being concepts or ideas connected to each other with some sort of line as a visual cue, concept maps indicate the specific relationships between relevant concepts, and that combination of a concept being the thing we see in boxes, the linking phrase that ties them together, and then the other concept provides what we call propositions, right? And so concept maps are mostly hierarchically organized. It's not a strict hierarchy. You can add kind of cross links and other ways to get around the hierarchy if that's relevant. But what these concept linking phrase concept form are propositions. So those are statements about the world. And so we can organize these statements hierarchically to create the overall concept map in the diagram. You can, again, you can have cycles, you can have, as I mentioned, cross links. And so the idea is to provide this kind of propositional structure so that learners can organize their learning around these propositions and then the structure of those propositions. And so concept maps, because we use these propositions, are a much richer visualization of mental models than mind maps. Between the linking phrases, the arrowheads, which you'll notice we always use arrowheads on our concluding concept to show which way that proposition should read. That is a much more rich way of having someone express what it is that they know. So let's talk about a few more features of good concept maps. Two key features to go over are focus questions, and then to dive just a bit deeper into the propositions. So a concept map should begin with a focus question. One could build concept maps all day and just keep on concept mapping and just make a bigger and bigger map. The focus question, though, enables us to provide the context and the boundaries for what kind of information should be in a map and what what is outside. Of course, at the end of the day, everything relates to everything else. But in order to turn this into a useful learning and assessment exercise, we provide a focus question that is the context and boundary for the map. Research has shown actually that the way that focus question is formed can actually have pretty important effects on the way that people express their concept maps or the way that they think about someone else's concept map. So for instance, you could ask the question, what are parts of the solar system? And you might expect essentially a list of planets and moons and stars. And that's what you asked for, right? What are the parts of the solar system? If you ask a more dynamic question, how do parts of the solar system affect life on Earth? You're going to elicit a mental model that is much more dynamic, much more interactive, much more explanatory in terms of getting the learner to realize that things affect other things, and really to be more expressive about how they think about the interactions and the dynamicism that are involved in systems. So concept maps should not just ask for a list of things. If you want a list of things, you can ask for a list of things. But you can create more dynamic maps by asking the focus question in a more dynamic kind of way. Back to propositions, again, this concept, linking phrase concept. It's super important that we stress here this arrowhead, because if you have a proposition that has two concepts, say the earth and the sun, and a linking phrase revolves around, there's only one way that arrowhead could point, which creates a true or an agreed upon proposition, right? The fact of the matter is that the sun does not revolve around the earth. And yet, if we didn't have this arrowhead to point the proper direction of the proposition, it could read either way. So in our practice, we're very very careful to get people to think about those arrowheads. This also gets us into the idea of sort of truth with regard to propositions. And, you know, we can talk about the way that students might express their concept map, and then reviewing that with them, giving them feedback. There's always in that feedback process, always some sort of reference to, say, the teacher's own mental model that enables that teacher to give the feedback to the student. And often that feedback comes in the form of correcting misconceptions. And so if a student was to have the sun revolves around the earth as a proposition, that feedback would be to correct that misconception, either about that proposition or to have a learning activity that helps that student make that conceptual change. And so we, as we talk about Sero and how we use concept mapping for assessment, we are quite interested in this idea that propositions can be true and false, or they can be more correct than other propositions. And so there are certainly disciplines where that sort of truthfulness, correctness, if you will, is more part of the lexicon and more part of the you know, common body of knowledge. You know, there are certain truths, or at least truths as up until now, these things are true. And so we do see concept mapping used in all disciplines. We certainly see it used in the sciences, but it's also been used quite broadly in mathematics and social sciences, as well as a technique in English and in learning other languages. And so again, this directionality of the propositions really matters to us, because we're interested in correcting those misconceptions, and misconceptions can be in any discipline, but we find that in some disciplines we can get even more preciseness, if you will, about the correctness of the propositions. So a quick engagement for those who are in the session. Just thinking about this arrowhead. So if you had two concepts, say poverty and literacy rate, what sort of linking phrase could you imagine to be used in between those concepts in a map of whatever your mental model is. So how do you think about poverty and literacy rates with regard to their relationship? And you can just plop them in the chat and we'll talk about them. And then also, it depends on that arrowhead, right? So one thing might affect the other. They both might affect each other. And so as you think about what sort of linking phrase might go into the proposition, think about which way that arrowhead would go. So is it poverty negatively affects literacy rates, or is it in the other direction for you? And again, context, of course, matters. The focus question matters, but yeah, good. So negatively affects is correlated to negatively affects. So this is an exercise that we go through when we're teaching people how to build good concept maps, is to really think about not only what concepts need to be in there, but what linking phrases, which direction that arrowhead should point. Another thing that we're always giving feedback on is just the specificity of the linking phrases themselves. So negatively affects is a very specific linking phrase, is correlated to, tells us something about it, but doesn't tell us anything about directionality or the severity or that sort of thing. So we're always trying to get people also to think through those linking phrases and how they can be as specific as possible within the context of the map. So I want to spend the last couple of minutes just talking about how concept mapping can be used in the classroom. Collective concept map building is a technique that a lot of teachers will use. So either as a group creating a concept map about a given focus question, perhaps it can be put on the whiteboard or in the smart board. We also often break out to smaller groups, and so have a small group work on a concept map, maybe have several groups work on a concept map against the same focus question, and then present those to the rest of the class for that continuing discussion. Collaborative concept mapping, we know, has been used at all grades in pre-K through 12, but also quite a bit in higher education and in doctoral and medical training and even higher levels of learning. So that collective concept map building, you can use all sorts of tools. It can be paper and pencil. You can certainly use concept mapping software, but any tool that you use ought to be sort of flexible in that it can be easily shared and easily edited. So collective concept map building is something we definitely promote. Active studying with concept maps, that can just be students building their own maps over time. And as Ian showed earlier this morning, you can enable the students themselves to see how their own mental models, their own concept maps have changed over time. Organizing literature and other resources via concept maps is something that a number of software tools support, but students, they'll have a syllabus, but they might also be able to create their own pathway through that learning and then capture that and as Ian showed, see where the tangential connections are to other knowledge areas. So concept mapping, just as a tool that students can learn how to use and organize their own knowledge, is tremendously valuable. And then lastly, I'll talk briefly about concept map-based assessment. So again, this is the idea of using concept mapping activities as an assessment task. I want to walk through this briefly to suggest that there's all sorts of things that folks can do with regard to concept mapping and how to use them as an assessment. And there are trade-offs for each of those kinds of activities. So on the one hand, if you think sort of giving a student just a blank sheet of paper, for instance, or a blank screen on the computer and tell them to go forth and create their own concept map, they now have to come up with the content for that map, the concepts, the linking phrases, the propositions, and then also to structure how are they going to organize those propositions. Doing that sort of thing can be tremendously insightful. Again, concept mapping from scratch is not that different than writing an essay or developing a lab notebook from scratch. The challenge, though, is that from an evaluation or an assessment perspective, they can be very hard to evaluate. There are rubrics and metrics for just evaluating concept maps for the characteristics of the maps, or you can give the feedback with regard to those misconceptions and propositions. But again, in a larger classroom setting, and certainly at a maybe even a nationalized scale for assessment, that sort of thing is just not very scalable. Tremendously valuable, yet not scalable. On the upper right, then, if you gave a student a complete concept map, that might be, and perhaps you even had them do something with the concept map, give feedback on it, or give feedback to someone else. We like to think of that as sort of the less insightful but easier to evaluate approach. So the more content and more structure that's provided, the easier it is to assess the maps, score the maps if you want, but you're going to get less insight about the learner themselves. So what we're trying to do is sort of play within this gray oval. So not require the students to do all the work and to come up with all the content structure, but also not giving away the entire map itself. So what we've developed with Sero is a way to sort of play within the formative and summative arenas, but to have combinations of activities that enable students to exercise higher order thinking skills. And so what we've tried to do, again, is to help with the design of the assessments using concept maps that are built against content from a learning course, help the learner and the teacher sort of scaffold them around this whole process, handle the assigning, the analyzing and the maps, and provide useful feedback both to the learner and to the teacher. And to provide grades to compare the expert or the teacher or the content map, the referent map, against the learner's activities and what they've done with the maps. So I'll show more of this sort of thing on Thursday, but I want to go back to this just to get everybody grounded in the idea that concept mapping can be a very useful activity. You can create variations of concept mapping. You can use parts of the concept mapping process as an assessment tool. And that's what we've built into Sero. So again, you're going to see some of this on Thursday. Everyone's welcome to visit our website at serolearn.com. We've got lots of resources on there about how to go about using concept mapping as an assessment tool. And we're always looking for pilot testers of our tools. So reach out if that is an interest as well. And with that, I will wrap up my piece and we will continue on with the afternoon. Thank you all for listening, and I hope I've spurred more interest in concept mapping. It's kind of hard to follow Ian in that kind of talk, but if you liked what Ian had to say with regard to his broader thesis, I'd also encourage you to look into a lot of his concept mapping work, because it's fantastic. I've learned a lot from Ian just about concept mapping, and would encourage you to do the same. So Jeff, I think we're back on time. I'm going to stop sharing.
Perfect timing. Yes, close enough, Brian. Close enough. Really interesting session, and you know, like some of the newer things we talked about this morning, like peer-to-peer assessment and the others. It's really interesting to see what some of the technology can allow us to do if we have new ideas that we want to install. Although concept mapping, not a new idea, I do appreciate that. What I'm going to do now, if I may, is say thank you for the moment, Brian, and I'm now going to hand over to Christine, who's going to take us through the second session this afternoon. And we have two of the speakers within the room, and we have the third speaker who's about to join us. So without further ado, if Christine is there, I will hand over to Christine, and she will introduce our three speakers today. Are you there, Christine?
Yes. Can you hear me, Jeff?
Yes, I can indeed. I shall leave you to.
All right. Thanks, Jeff. Awesome presentations today. I'm excited to present the speakers for our next session, which is going to get a little bit more into assessment tools. So far this day, we've talked a lot about different assessment practices and a little bit about innovative tools that you can use with Sero and TAO assessments. But our speakers for this upcoming session are going to be talking about video game-based assessment, playful assessment, and then we're going to talk about how you can get your hands on some research and development funds for developing new and innovative assessment products. So our speakers are going to be Lindsey Tropf, who is the founder and CEO of Immersed Games, Louisa Rosenheck, who's the director of Pedagogy at Kahoot, and Ed Metz, who works for the U.S. Department of Education and manages their Small Business Innovation Research Program. So we're going to just kick off the session. I'm going to hand it over to Lindsey so that we can get as much time as possible for each speaker.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Christine. You ready for me to just jump in?
Yep, you can go ahead and share your screen and want to make sure you get as much time as possible. So off to you, Lindsey.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me here. So as Christine said, we're going to be focusing on tools. And so for that, I've been asked to present about ours that I've made, which is Title Online, a science video game. So we'll be talking about assessment in a problem-based STEM video game here. Quickly, my background is in education. I was working on a PhD in school psychology with specializations in evaluation, using data to make good decisions for learning. And so this has definitely been an area of a lot of interest for me as we kind of think about what assessment means in the context of an instructional game that's really problem-based as well. So as I mentioned, we'll be using our game that we created called Title Online here. And in Title Online, we essentially use a game because we can set up authentic, meaningful problems that students go in and they are solving them. So for example, one of our ecology storylines we have has students go into the Amazon rainforest. They get to take over as robot ants and investigate these mysterious deaths where fungus is exploding from their heads. They analyze data, they actually look at samples of the spores, they build arguments from evidence about what is going on and if we should intervene. So there's a lot going on that they're able to jump into. In the scope of our whole game, though, we have made it as a platform. So we actually have a few different types of content, and I'll be going over kind of what assessment means in light of these different types of, I guess, play. The first one, storyline, is I showed you a quick example there. We consider this kind of the entry point for science practices where students are kind of doing guided inquiry while they solve problems. We also have sandboxes, which are more open-ended. So these are big simulation-based experiences. I'll show you more where they can even design their own experiments and ask their own questions in those. And then we have something in progress with a grant with the National Science Foundation called Expeditions, which is kind of the endpoint of where we want to get. We're focused on like middle and high school here, where we want to get them, where they can actually solve big problems and apply engineering and go through this super open-ended experience, collaborating in small groups. This is where we want to get students to go. So we see this as kind of a sequence that gets more complex as you go, as we build up student skills. So I'm going to just jump into the first one. For each of these, I'll show you just a very quick about kind of what it is, and then what that means in terms of the type of assessment that we can do from it. So storylines are our current practice that we're really, we have the most complete set of tools and assessments available for. So the mechanics, and in this context, mechanics means kind of like what exactly you do in the video game that we have here are around gathering data and then creating conclusions, figuring out what's going on. So there's a lot of different ways you can collect evidence in the game world. You might run an experiment, make observations, analyze data, look at something under a microscope, and then build arguments or explanations from evidence in the game world as well. So we have a bunch of different mechanics that you use to do that. Some of these are, say, picture click, where we show you like a seal skin sample that's healthy and the one that's sick, and we try to compare and see if that's what's wrong. You talk to people. You might use an item, in this case, to make someone sneeze so you can get some of their snot. Build arguments, scan items. So what we do in turn of the assessment is we look at which of these things are actually generating ideas or really synthesis. The student is doing something we can assess. So, you know, we don't need to really show the teacher that they use an item or they talk to someone per se. They know that that happened in guided learning, but we kind of highlight some areas where the student has actually generated knowledge and shown, synthesized that they can do it. So in this case, in this list of samples, they've built arguments or created a flow chart to show how an ecosystem is working or how genes are being passed along or something like that. And so these are things, of course, we're able to pass on to educators in the dashboard. And so we take a kind of similar approach here in the game. This is what the flow chart looks like on the left. In this case, they may have created a food web. And then for the teacher, we're able to do similar. The teacher can pull it up later and see how the students did. We have a general grading here of like green, yellow, orange. Did well, struggled a little, struggled a lot, because we're really avoiding assigning grades to this because it's this kind of experimental process in games where we expect a lot of failure, and we don't want teachers to see, ABC and go give them grades for this, because it will really discourage their ability to iterate and figure out answers in a game context where that sort of experience is what we want them to do. So, but we do show the kind of correct solution that students came to, and then what are different incorrect things that happen. So in this case, 20% of students made an extra connection between these. They thought probably that the wolverines eat the berries, but that's not the case. And so kind of pulling out some mistakes here and making that more clear for educators as well, based on what the students did in the game. Pretty simple in terms of what we're able to do here. Argument builder is similar. After the students have collected all this data and they've built kind of claims and sentences to support it from that. So in this example, they're trying to figure out something was invasive species, and they kind of built a sentence here with their own connecting reasoning words to generate and argue for that. The teacher dashboard, therefore, does similar. We show what claims did the students argue for, how long did it really take them to iterate till they did well on it, what were the questions, and what are the exact arguments that the students were able to generate here. And of course, sorting them by kind of more common incorrect arguments so that the teachers can see if a lot of students did this incorrect argument, do I think this is a problem or kind of a minor mistake or something. Sometimes it's something that you might actually want to address because it indicates some sort of misconception. So that kind of highlights that out for teachers so that they can see that. Or for another example that I hadn't shown you yet, we do have students' least favorite thing in the video game, a research task, as one of your science practices is the ability to figure out information from readings. And so the students are able to read articles and figure out relevant citations. And then of course we show the teachers the article and what they were able to do in terms of if they thought something was a relevant citation to support an argument or didn't select something that was. So kind of summarizing this as a base level. But from there, we really want to synthesize that for teachers to make it easier to understand what's going on. Quite frankly, not a lot of teachers are spending time in actual usage digging through all that work product information. What exact arguments did my students build? What exact flowcharts did every student build? So what we do is we pull this into a main part of the dashboard, which highlights on the left here, you see the struggling areas. So we say, for instance, that 5 students are indicating they have a misconception. Okay, this was a mock-up. We do not have that yet. That is a future thing. But for instance, something that we do have is saying that a number of students are struggling to generate an argument around a certain concept area, and you can click through and see why here. And then we also summarize these into performance expectations. So we take that grading that we did for each of the tasks and all of the ones that are assigned to say a certain standard, we will roll that up and say, because you did really well on all of these, then you seem to really understand the standard, or kind of average it together and figure out if it's that you're struggling on a specific standard as well there. And so these are how we can kind of roll this into something that is a little more manageable for the teachers, and then they can click through in order to figure more things out. And so a key takeaway from this is really presenting information that is useful for teachers for instruction and understanding what they're actually going to use. When we were really looking at samples of what people were doing, what we really saw was there was a lot of, your kid's level 10, and what does that mean for a teacher? And we didn't want to focus there. We wanted to focus on, here's where your kids are struggling, here's kind of how they're doing, and you can drill down and figure out ways to support them. Some of the future directions that we're going to be going from here are adding a live dashboard. This is a huge request. The benefit being that we can really highlight a moment in time where the students need help and add new features like teacher coaching and things like that, maybe suggested questions teachers could ask kids to help them work through problems. And sometimes it's hard to conceptualize how to work alongside this, and instructional guidance. So as I indicated, doing things like saying there are certain misconceptions, maybe you could assign a certain quest to help them improve. are things we can be able to add on in the future and really pull out to help teachers be able to customize and personalize more based on the data, but isn't something we've really had time and funding to work on yet. Okay, so I know I'm starting to come up against time. I was told I could push my time a little bit. So I'm going to go more quickly through our sandboxes and expeditions because these are more kind of developing. We don't really have rich assessment built in the dashboard yet because they're really complex and have kind of interesting challenges or we're still developing it. So as I indicated, our sandboxes are larger simulation-based experiences. So for example, you can build an ecosystem from scratch or bring a planet to life. These, as you can imagine, have a lot of data behind them. The ecosystem data, we have it for each kind of component and the trophic levels. And you can look at this one, which is actually funded by the last speaker in this session. We have tons of data about temperature, elevation, air masses going on here that students can use. But they also have infinite choices and possibilities. And so, the more abstract and open-ended the experience gets, the more difficult it really is for us to be able to take this and turn it into the type of assessment we did for storylines, because those are more guided and it was a lot simpler to kind of pull that together into useful components for teachers. So for this, what we really did instead for right now is we did supplemental activities. Part of this also was that it's an instructional tool. So for instance, for that weather and climate sandbox, we have a challenge, can you melt your North Pole? And the students are able to chart out what they tried, what happened, and on the back, we have them diagram and show how all the different components of the simulation work together to melt the North Pole, and they figured it out. So they're doing modeling as well. So this is something that was a lot cheaper and faster for us to build and provide. It's an instructional tool for teachers. And it really avoids students being punished for inquiry and iteration process and gives them a way to really solidify their learning. And teachers can grade this and actually give the letter grades that they want to do as well. So this is one thing that we've really done. And that's another takeaway is really that not everything has to be handled within the game as well. There's kind of a mix of what we can do to use these tool sets and kind of give the teachers supports alongside them while we're still building out some of these really interesting, advanced, complex things that we might not really have capacity to do very well yet. And we do the same thing for our storylines. So for our storylines, we have a summary table that students can do. So if teachers want to grade and I say, please don't give them a C because they got an orange rating, instead I suggest, why don't you use one of these things? The kids have more control over that and you can kind of grade this separately. And again, kind of simple instructional tools like an OWL and Observe Under Learn board that can be used to increase learning here right alongside the game and our assessment too, since this is all kind of wrapped into this idea of formative assessment. Of course, the future direction we want to go is to actually build more data into the dashboard. We just haven't had the time and resources to do this yet. And one of our big challenges here is kind of designing this around unique goals of the simulation. And how do we show that students are making good decisions? Did they see that there was a problem and make a correct decision to correct for that? Or were they kind of randomly trying things? So we've been conceptualizing out different ideas, being able to, for instance, show in a play session if the health of an ecosystem went up or down by the end of that play session would let the teacher know if maybe they need to drill in a little bit more, talk to the kid, or look at the rest of their data. So we're also mapping out what it might look like, for instance, to do traffic levels. So and highlight where it's off so that teachers could be able to more quickly see where students were struggling to maybe they need to add a lot more producers here, or this isn't going to balance, things like that can really pull out key concepts from the broader simulations, but it's going to take some more time for us. So 2 more minutes. Expeditions is the thing that we're still working on with the NSF, which is a live simulation where something is going wrong that we need to identify what's going wrong and then actually solve it and iterate on engineering solutions. We collect individual data points, turn those into graphs, and review them to kind of pull it together and make interpretations, and then actually collaborate together into 3 to 5 students in a group, creating knowledge boards, uploading kind of what we think is wrong and kind of progressing that way. So thinking about our key takeaways here and what we're going to do to make this useful in the future is kind of where we are at this point. So, presenting information that's useful to teachers, we've really been doing teacher interviews to think about it. Most of them say they would want to use as a capstone assessment. So we're kind of talking with them about what it would look like if we provided a rubric, maybe had a rubric that all the quantitative components like did kids create 2 graphs were filled out automatically, but then we supported them in faster grading of the qualitative parts, like did they actually make a good analysis? They also, of course, want really good ideas of collaboration if one student did everything. So how can we simply kind of pull that information in and present that is one of the kind of challenges coming up. And of course, on the other side, our other key takeaway that we've learned over the last couple of years is not everything has to be in the game. So we're also playing with ideas of printing the rubric. Kids can follow along and understand their goals, or creating guides like hypothesis checklists that can be used both for assessment, self-assessment, and a scaffold as students develop these skills. And these are things that we're also kind of thinking about as like paper prototypes that after we iterate a few times, we can build into the game if they end up being particularly helpful as well. Okay, that was a lot. There is no comments in here, so hopefully I haven't totally overwhelmed everyone. I think there's going to be group Q&A at the end of all this, so I will stop talking and let our next speaker go and hang around for the questions at the end.
All right, thanks so much, Lindsey. I'm just going to hand it right off to you, Louisa.
Okay, great. Let me get my slides up. Hold on, let me just get my slides in the right place. Okay. Hello. Okay, I'll start with my title slide. I'm really happy to be here and talk to you all about playful assessment. So I am the director of pedagogy at Kahoot, as Christine said, but I have done a lot of different work in edtech design, learning games design, game-based assessment, and playful learning and playful assessment. So just a little bit about me. I have worked for many years at MIT in a few different groups doing research and design of learning games. A lot of the same principles that Lindsey talked about, and really thinking about what does learning look like? How can we tell that learning is happening? What kinds of skills are demonstrated in games and in different kinds of games and in different kinds of play experiences? So what I want to talk to you all about today is the idea of playful assessment, and I like to use a metaphor of chocolate milk. So what I like to say about chocolate milk is you can easily imagine that the play is the chocolate and the milk is the assessment, right? We have like the fun stuff and we have the stuff that's good for you. But it's so important to understand that these two things, playful learning and assessment, they're not just two sides of the same coin. They're much closer than that. And they work best together when they're completely mixed up, which is why you get chocolate milk. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why play is good for assessment and also why assessment is so important in play. So one thing to think about is the skills that we really care about are often not displayed in multiple choice questions. That's, I think that's why we're all here at this conference. But they are often displayed in play. So we want to think about, where do learners demonstrate those skills that we really care about? And those could be, social emotional skills, 21st century skills. I like to call them future ready skills. Things like, navigating ambiguity, social negotiation, demonstrating iteration, all these kinds of things. When we have more traditional forms of assessment and more traditional forms of learning, we're not creating an environment where learners can demonstrate those skills. But in play, which could be games, but it could also be creative activities like maker spaces. It could be, building something, putting on a skit, creating anything. Those kinds of play experiences, you see these types of skills become visible a lot more. So two areas that I like to think about, and then I want to encourage everyone to consider when we think about playful assessment. One is assessing playful learning. So learning is becoming more student-centered and inquiry-based and playful, and that's so great. But how do we assess those kinds of learning experiences? We know that it doesn't work to kind of stop the play and creative learning and switch over to a conventional type of assessment. That's not good for flow. It doesn't capture what we care about. So how can we assess playful learning? And also thinking about play activities as the assessment. So that could be you do some learning experience and then you have a game or something playful that functions as an assessment. It could also be, thinking about the chocolate milk, how are these two things just brought together much more closely so that the learning is the assessment. You're being assessed and gathering evidence of your learning while you're engaging in this playful, creative kind of learning. So I think these two aspects are very related, but there is a distinction. And I like that Lindsey in her presentation also talked about, the assessment that happens in the game, as well as not everything has to happen inside of the game or inside of the technology. So I'm going to give just a couple examples of each of these types of assessments that we can think about. So here's a couple of examples of tools that are assessments. So these are ways that we can kind of do the assessing in the tool. And of course, one of them is Kahoot. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Kahoot. It is largely a quiz-based platform, very popular with teachers and students. There's a lot of opportunity for user-generated content. So teachers and students as well can create their own Kahoots, their own quizzes based on the topic, based on what they've learned. So if you're familiar with Kahoot, you will know that a lot of the Kahoot questions are multiple choice, but that's not all it can do. So when I think about Kahoot as an assessment, I really like to think about it more expansively. So how can we use, different kinds of questions? There are word cloud questions and open-ended kinds of questions to get a quick pulse check on what students are thinking. You can do a poll question that doesn't have one right answer, but that really gauges students' interest or knowledge or comfort with the topic, for example. And the Kahoot format has this friendly competition. It kind of brings people together into a powerful social experience that feels playful for many people. So Kahoot is one example of a playful assessment that many teachers like to use. And going even further with Kahoot, I would say a great way to do assessment using this tool is to have students create their own Kahoots. So they've learned something, they've researched a topic, and then to demonstrate their understanding, they can create their own Kahoot, host it for everybody, and that gives them this agency as well. So some of these, very popular, commonly used tools, such as Kahoot, can be interesting, playful assessments. Another example, going much more complex, a bit deeper, there's a company called Immersed, and they do game-based assessments, skills assessments. They really are looking at skills and disposition. They're used a lot in corporate hiring processes, for example. And so they create these very rich simulations where the player has to make a lot of complex choices and navigate systems. And there are very complex metrics in the back that then measure these skills and dispositions. So both of these are tools where the assessment is happening in the tool. So you use the tool as a way to assess knowledge, skills, understanding. The other aspect that I'm going to talk about is tools that provide assessment environments. So this is where the assessment and the data collection doesn't have to always happen in the play experience automatically, but it can provide an environment in which students are demonstrating their skills. And then that can be observed and evidence can be gathered to make claims about what students are learning. So great example that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, Minecraft. Minecraft EDU is a great resource that lots of teachers are using to teach in their classrooms with Minecraft. And it's not that, you don't do Minecraft and then it spits out a grade or an evaluation or a rubric, but it creates this really rich play environment for students to get creative and collaborate and work together. And by giving them this experience, it is an opportunity to observe those skills and observe what they do and gather evidence about certain objectives that you may be looking for. Similarly, Scratch, another favorite. Scratch is such a great programming environment where students can really express themselves and create little games and animations. And there are so many skills that go into that. So again, Scratch is not going to, deliver a report that says, here's how this student did, and here's what skills they're building, but all of that can be observed and documented while students are playing. So how do we do that? How do we gather evidence of learning in these types of creative assessment, playful assessment environments? There are a number of ways that we can think about, and I don't have time to go in detail about these, but think about self-assessment. So if students know what skills we want them to be building, what constructs they should be watching out for in themselves, they can self-evaluate, they can reflect on what they've done in that Scratch project, for example, or how they've done more than they did in the last project. Similarly, peer assessment. The more we talk about and build a classroom culture of recognizing skills and celebrating different skills, peers can help assess each other and notice the great things that each other are doing and give feedback. Portfolios are, of course, a great way, and that goes along with these self-assessment, peer assessment, as well as rubrics. So if you have rubrics that are, maybe a single point rubric, or things that are very descriptive, doesn't have to be just a rating scale, then that can be a big part of feeding into your portfolio, where you can show, here's a project where I really worked on my collaboration. Here's a project where I really worked on my technical skills. So that can all come together. And without these tools that provide this environment, provide an opportunity to demonstrate learning, you wouldn't have, things to put in your portfolio that are meaningful. And finally, observation protocols. So these can be, teachers and students themselves coming up with, okay, what does it look like for me to navigate ambiguity or to manage my emotions in a frustrating project? And then that can help them observe, watch each other, and then document, oh, that was an example of this. And I saw them, I saw my peer, supporting another learner or giving feedback in a good way. So if you have kind of preset ideas of how you observe and where you document things, that is a great way to assess playful learning without kind of interrupting the play and inserting those conventional assessments. So it's very embedded into the learning. So these are just a handful of ways that we can think about reflecting and assessing skills in playful learning experiences. So to wrap up, the idea of this chocolate milk metaphor is that play and assessment are one and the same. They do not need to be separate activities. We should leverage play to make assessments not only more fun and palatable, but also richer and more authentic. The best learning we do is often through play and creativity, and so assessment should be that too. And again, and also when we have playful learning, there's no learning without reflection. So we have to bring play to assessment, but we also really need to bring assessment to our playful creative learning. So they benefit very much from each other. And the most important thing about playful assessment is that it's a great way to put our assessment in line with what we really value and how we want to be teaching. Thank you so much for listening to Playful Assessment. I hope that it gives you some ideas of ways that you can incorporate this into your own work. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Louisa. That was a perfect follow-up to Lindsey's presentation. And I see Ed is on. So Ed, I'm just going to kick it over to you because we're doing well on time right now. And you
all
can
right.
go ahead.
Well, thanks so much.
Yeah.
I mean, what an honor to follow Lindsey and Louisa. Amen to what you were just saying, Louisa. I'm totally there with you. I love the chocolate milk metaphor. So my talk's going to be a little different. It's basically a public service announcement to all you great education technology developers and researchers out there looking to fund the next generation of assessments that go beyond multiple choice. I lead the Department of Education Small Business Innovation Research Program, which provides funding for new education technology innovations. Obviously, new forms of assessment are a perfect way to fund projects. So just my presentation is going to be in two parts. I'm just going to give you some basic details about the program, and then I'm going to follow up with 5 examples of projects we funded in recent years, and then we'll get back to the Q&A with my 2 co-presenters. So, in case you were not aware, the Small Business Innovation Research Program provides up to $1.25 million to US-based for-profit edtech developers to develop and create and evaluate new commercially viable forms of edtech. And in recent years, tens of millions of students have used the products out of this program, including many assessments. The structure of the program, if you're not familiar, there's a phase 1 that's 8 months for $250K to develop a prototype and conduct initial research on the prototype. The phase 2 is for $2 million, 2 years for $1 million for full-scale research and development and pilot testing. You have to win a phase 1 in order to apply for the phase 2. Although we do have a direct to phase 2 program, not to confuse everybody out there. If you're an academic researcher and you've created an initial evidence-based prototype, take a look at this direct to phase 2 option because it could be for you. The 2023 timeline, this is perfect timing right here. Our solicitations are set to come out around January 10th, 2023. Proposals will be due March 10th. We're going to make about 14 phase 1 awards. And the 2 priority areas are ed tech for general education and ed tech for special education across just about every content area that would occur in a school situation. Okay, some resources here. If you take a picture of a screen, this is the one. It has our website. It has our solicitation page where you can download the solicitations from last year to get an idea of what you need to do. I'm available to talk to you guys in the next 2 months to hear about your ideas and field your questions one-to-one. And the other thing is we do have a research grant program at the Institute of Education Sciences where I work. The links to those programs are there. Those requests for applications will come out in late spring, and those projects do indeed fund the development of new forms of assessment and research to validate the assessment. Just some quick tips for everybody out there. If you're thinking about applying, obviously you have to propose something that's new, that's going to make a significant difference in education. Research is crucial. Include past research findings to show that there's an evidence base for whatever it is you're doing, and then research strong plans for the project to evaluate whatever you develop. And if it's an assessment, reliability and validity studies are crucial. Include 3 letters to demonstrate that you have commercial pathways waiting for you for when the product is developed, that you'll be able to get it to market at scale and have that great impact that you're looking to have. Lastly, make sure you have a team that includes expertise in research, in development, in business, and in the particular area of study. And if in the case of assessment, I'm assuming you're going to have an AI or machine learning or natural language processing expert as well for new forms of adaptive assessment. Okay, part 2 of the presentation, I'm going to go through quickly. Obviously, we're looking to go beyond multiple choice. Thanks, Brian, for coming up with that great title years ago. And in recent years, about half of all awards have developed a new form of assessment for use in education, whether diagnostic, formative, summative, or performance-based, with dashboards to present results to educators to inform their practice. Here are the examples for you. First, we have Moby Read, which is a diagnostic informative assessment. And this one is where students will read a passage out loud into an iPad, and the technology will assess their oral reading fluency in real time on prosody, on reading comprehension and word count, and it will give the results to the student and to the educator immediately. And it will say exactly what the scores were in those areas, in those domains. The advantages of this type of technology is that it's very engaging for students to do an assessment, actually, because they're reading into an iPad and they're getting their data immediately and they're doing it by themselves. They're not doing it in front of everybody else. So there's less stress. There's no administration or grading. the results come out immediately. And rather than an educator using a rubric to assess or reading fluency across a large number of students, it's being done for them. So it saves that time and it's more consistent and accurate. Second example is the A2I, Assessment 2 Instruction. And this is a reading assessment as well. It's for diagnostic, formative, and summative purposes. Assessments, students do regularly scheduled digital reading assessments, and the dashboard presents the results back to educators in real time. This one gives students adaptive scaffolded support as they go to meet their level of reading. Once again, it provides information to teachers to inform individual and group instruction. The A2I, based in years of IES-funded basic research. Oh, and by the way, A2I was acquired by Scholastic this year, and Moby Read was actually acquired by Google early in the year, both to integrate these innovations into their product suites. Third example is a really important area, which I'm so excited about, those of you who are developing performance-based assessments, where students engage in activities, in this case, a virtual science lab. And then as they go, the technology is updating and meeting them at whatever level they're at, scaffolding their learning based on feedback from earlier tasks and activities, and giving real-time reports to teachers, all the way to mastery. And I guess the hope here is that these types of technologies can take away the need for then an end of unit test. Because if you make it to the end of a performance-based assessment, you should then have demonstrated mastery and not need to do that test at the end of the unit. So here I wrote it that one of the features that can replace end of unit tests, provide those hints and inform instruction. Teachly and Numbershire, they're separate math games, and these are used to provide that formative feedback once again as students engage with game-based play. Very engaging content, and provides that adaptive scaffolded learning opportunity and teacher dashboard that you see in the picture. Finally, we have a ZooU. It's more than just academic content. There are assessments for social and emotional learning. In this game, students progress through social learning scenarios, and they're challenged to respond the assessment determines how they would respond. And then teachers get reports about students' social and emotional learning based on their responses in the game. But students also get the tips to sharpen up their social and emotional learning. So finishing up here, yes, let's go beyond multiple choice. These are some of my favorite relics for my days in school years ago. So thanks a lot. I look forward to connecting to everybody. Please shoot me an email about what you're doing, and connect to me on Twitter and LinkedIn. And I'll look forward to the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Ed. And I'm going to invite Louisa and Lindsey to come back online for a Q&A. We actually have ample time for that, so that's exciting. I have a few questions, and then I'll look at the chat to see if any others do. First, I wanted to just kind of synthesize some of my thoughts around the different presentations, because that was a lot of content, kind of rapid fire, but I don't think we could have planned a more perfect transition. And also I want to mention, I discovered in the green room that you all three kind of know each other already. So it's a small assessment world out here. But Lindsey, one thing that kind of stood out to me with your presentation was how perfectly it actually followed Brian's, because I saw some similarity between the statements that students are able to make in your video game, the argument builders, and how they kind of resemble those concept mapping propositions and allow both learners and teachers to be able to really pinpoint where their conceptual strengths and weaknesses are. So I thought that was an interesting tie-in. You mentioned that one of the kind of time and resource constraints that you have right now are around developing some of those new dashboard features. Can you speak a little bit more around any specific challenges that you're facing as a a technology kind of startup creator. So time and resources, I know there we can dive down into that a little bit more. Is it, do you need more startup funding? Is it hard getting investment from schools, or what specific roadblocks are you encountering?
Yeah, I mean, schools don't particularly provide investment. You'd just be kind of selling to schools, and revenue is the best investment, since you don't have to give away your company for revenue and stuff. But yeah, it's an interesting component because a lot of this work is, grant funded. So like, did you get the phase 2? I'm pointedly looking at it, to do some of this, or maybe you don't get to finish some of that work if you didn't, but you got a different grant, right? So it's like, I actually didn't get to add the sandbox assessment data from like one of the things we built, because we didn't get this follow-on grant for that, but we got a new grant, so we started working. And so you end up with some kind of work a little left unfinished from that side of things, depending on if you're able to get those grants and kind of what competition was that cycle. Investors don't really want to put a ton to R&D unless you have like really strong data that like schools really want it. And as I said, like, most teachers are not right now actually looking at anything except kind of completion and high level, like our summary level data. They're not actually going and like pulling in. So I think we can get them there if we add more, hey, because your students did this, we suggest you do this, and more of those kind of instructional supports, but they're not necessarily asking for it yet. I think they know what could be possible, and there's this idea we need data. Data is good, but we're not really an assessment tool, so that's not really what they're thinking about with us, and it's not kind of highest on their wish list, right? Higher on their wish list are 3 other things, minus a live dash. During COVID, that was very high on the wish list, but now they're back in school, they don't need it as much anymore, and so it's kind of, where can I use my funds that's actually going to move us kind of to the next like safety milestone and break even as a company, so that then I can, once we have some extra money to play with, I can do some of this fun stuff that's kind of me taking bets that I can move behavior. But right now I have to go based on what people are asking for, really, and what is going to let us get there. I see Louisa nodding plenty.
Yeah, I would emphasize a lot of that, just having perspective from academia and research as well as industry. It's really hard. I mean, we're all up here talking and thinking about how to go beyond multiple choice and how to really assess these kinds of skills that we really value. But it's very hard to make change in schools. They're very resistant, and it's not due to teachers or any one person, it's the system. And so it's very hard to, we have all these ideas and great methods to do richer, more student-centered assessments, but it's very hard to build those into tools that are going to sell and that are going to really scale in schools and in districts, just because of the systems and what people have to value. So that's kind of a very high level kind of philosophical question, but I think all the examples that Lindsey and Ed have shown are really important to keep getting out there, and also, build capacity and build understanding in what kind of assessment we really should be doing.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, one more sentence, I'll stop. When I showed you guys that scaffold of like our easiest to our middle to our most difficult content we're building, like 95% of our usage is on that easiest like content. The more open-ended complex stuff is not being used very much either. And so, we're building community right now and working on PD. And so it's something that we're trying to figure out when teachers have capacity, but I see this as a multi-year thing. As teachers build capacity, hopefully burnout reduces a bit and stuff, can we kind of move them in that direction? And by the time, we're done with some of the stuff, maybe they'll actually be ready to use it. But right now, like, not many teachers have capacity for more than like the simplest type of content we have. Sorry, I think Ed unmuted himself as well.
Yeah, that's I'd love for you to chime in on that, Ed, and that kind of speaks to why we started to try to develop this conference as more of a space to get a different multifaceted perspectives, because we are seeing there's so many rich and innovative tools that have the potential for this deeper, more immersive form of assessment, but we're still not seeing the implementation at the pace that we'd like to. In your role at the Department of Education, is that a conversation that's taking place on a high level about how to actually get these tools into schools and identify what the specific policy barriers might be to that?
I love to answer every and all questions, but I don't have an answer from a high level policy leadership perspective there. I'm in the research office, so I'm always focused on the portfolio that I manage and the program I lead. I'm hoping the conversation is occurring. I'm sure it is. I should say that. What I would say too is beyond multiple choice, thanks for doing this work. And I'm curious if you guys have some kind of index or presentation of all the new kinds of assessment that could be a really valuable resource in and of itself. From my perspective, I hope in my career, by the time I reach the end at whatever point it is, that we've made a serious dent in this area, and that all those new forms of assessment have made it into practice. I mean, I guess that would be tied for first with my #1 career goal.
Yeah, and we always appreciate having you be involved, Ed. It's definitely a benefit to have access to those funds. One other question. So Louisa, maybe, I wonder if you can speak to, so in this realm of playful assessment, I love how you touched on the different soft skills that are really in high demand by employers that can be developed and demonstrated through playful assessments. Is there, in your experience, and I don't know if you have a perspective on this, is there any sort of domain? Because I know like Kahoot, for example, is not just in classrooms, but even in the workforce, people use it. Is there a domain where you're saying higher adoption or opportunity to expand use of playful assessment than others?
I think there's more traction in schools than in adult learning. And I think, and that probably holds for playful kinds of assessment, but particularly for playful learning, because that's naturally coming before people really think about playful assessment and how assessment could be playful. They're working on playful creative learning, which makes sense. I definitely notice that people who work with kids and develop materials for young people are much more open to the idea of playful learning and therefore playful assessment. And I really think that's mainly because we associate play with kids, right? It's child's play. And so that's great for kids. We definitely saw during the pandemic, there was a lot of talk of how kids just need to be out there playing. And this is a time when there needs to be more play experiences. So that was good. People felt play sort of had a resurgence or a moment during that time. But it's a much harder sell when it comes to older students or adults. And it's really a misconception, because everybody needs play in their lives, and everybody can explore and build new skills through play. And also play doesn't have to look like building with blocks or running around outside. It can be creating things in the makerspace. It can be working on the design thinking process to create a new innovative solution to anything. So play can be all those things, and it's just as important for adults, but I think it's harder for people to see that naturally.
Gotcha. Lindsey, I wonder if you, thinking about your experience again, specifically as someone who's developed this kind of innovative technology, looking back on your journey and doing that, are there any specific points thinking back where you're like, oh, I wish I had known this? Or if you were giving advice to someone else who was kind of starting from ground zero, but wanted to build an immersive assessment game like you have, what would be some key pieces of advice that you have?
On like the product side or the founder, I'm trying to get something to exist in this world side?
Actually, either both and would be really interesting to learn.
Okay, yeah, I think I could probably pick a little bit from both. We built too much before trying to sell it because of some advice we'd gotten about like it not being worth selling to schools. We only had like one piece of content. And then once I had like 3 areas, like, okay, I'll sell them now. And people were buying it for one, and I'm like, oh, I could have done this a lot sooner and learned a lot more, because we would have been, selling and learning that process from the business side and adoption earlier. Sure, the rate of people grabbing it when it was only 1 unit would have been a lot smaller, but it still would have been better than waiting. And then I think similarly, like I built something that was this ideal learning experience with the storylines and the sandbox, and you can kind of like apply what you learned in the storyline to get better at the sandbox and go back and learn more and keep getting better. And it's this beautiful learning loop. And like 5% of our users are in the sandboxes only right now. So kind of related to that in terms of just building a much smaller loop on the product side and kind of going out with that and really honing that with teachers and what they need and, you know, spending time. I could have even made the assessment a little better, done some of the future things we talked about for the storyline assessment. Maybe I could have built that instead of having built these sandboxes right now. Of course, when I talk to curriculum directors, you know, they drool over the sandboxes because this is the type of learning that they and I really, really want. It's just not what's getting used in mass yet. Again, I'm like starting to pitch them log scale. This year we'll do storylines. Next year we'll maybe talk your teachers into sandboxes. So maybe it's helped us. I don't know. I still think it probably wasn't the right decision. I should have built less, more complete, and kind of focused on getting people to use that. And, you know, if we were just adding the sandboxes next year, that probably would have been fine, you know, instead of having built that so early in the process. So yeah, small, go to market fast with something smaller. We could have saved a lot of development time and be doing just as well as we are right now, probably.
Oh yeah, that's really helpful. Ed, can you add to that at all? So with the applications that you're seeing coming in from technology developers that want the SBIR funding, are there any specific weak areas in the applications that you would advise others to kind of take note of when they're looking for these funds?
Yeah, I mean, I think Lindsey brings up a great point about the product market fit. So in your case, Lindsey, I'm sure having more content is a great thing. So it will, there's no question about that. But having those letters of commercial pathways. So in this case, finding the letter from the district says they have this precise need, like the oral reading fluency assessment would be a great example there. A very focused assessment that could be developed and that could immediately alleviate that time that it takes educators to do an assessment. And the other thing is obviously having the research team on your project that can validate once again the assessment that you're creating using the best measures available. Those are just a couple of quick tips.
Awesome. Let's see. All right. I think that this is a good place to wrap it up. Thank you to all of you for participating. That was really helpful and interesting content. And hopefully everyone in the audience benefited from it. I don't see any additional questions, so this seems like a good time to pass it over to Jeff and make sure we get our last session done on time. So Lindsey, Louisa, Ed, thanks so much for participating. And yeah, that was really, really great information.
And thank you, Christine, as well. Brilliant session, really good. Lots of good meaty stuff again. Been really excited by almost everything I've heard today. And we're on schedule. In fact, we're perfectly on schedule. We've reached the session, one of the sessions, I think, that I've probably been most looking forward to today, which is our panel discussion. I'm going to hand over in a moment to Martyn Roads, who will introduce Angela, Nathan and Jeff, our three panelists today, and talk you through the process. But I worked with Martyn for, well, probably more years than we care to remember, managing conferences and events and projects and programs all over the world. And it's a pleasure to invite him back and welcome him back to the Beyond Multiple Choice Conference, where he'll be chairing the final session. So as we bring everybody on, I'm going to take this opportunity of just handing back to Martyn. And it seems ages since I last said that, but it's only probably about a year. Take care.
Jeff.
Thank you, everybody. And brilliant speaking to you. Oh, I'll come back right at the end to say the thank yous, of course.
Okay, so hi, everybody. Just waiting for our three panelists to join us. Jeff is here already. Just waiting for Angela and Nathan, who are coming up rapidly. So good afternoon to you all. It's been a good day so far from what I've heard, and we are looking forward to this rounding off today's speakers and events. Just one little point. If you've got a question to put forward, then pop it up on the Q&A, and we'll try and fit it in. We have some starter questions, but before that, I'd like to introduce our three panelists. Angela Rupert is a learning architect at Mindlance Technologies, and she's an accredited learning and development leader with lots of experience in leading strategic learning initiatives and raising human effectiveness across diverse industries. Nathan is the CEO and founder of Assessment Systems, and he designs next generation software for assessment and psychometrics. I'm sure if I get any of this wrong from any of them, they'll correct me. And Jeff Fiske is the VP of production at Muzzy Lane, as is responsible for making sure their partners are successful in using their tools. So welcome to you all. I'm going to kick off with a couple of questions we've got. If you've got any from out there in the audience, as they say, pop them on the Q&A, and we'll try and pick them up from you. So first of all, and I'm going to come to Angela first, if that's all right, Angela. The first question, what do you think have been the biggest improvements or innovations in e-assessment over the last 5 to 10 years? What's really changed from the early days, if you like?
Well, so I come from a corporate L&D lens. And so some of the struggles that we have in corporate training are a little different than, K-12 and higher ed. I've been in all of those industries, so I've felt those different pains in every one of them. So for me, I would say some of the biggest innovations that I've seen probably in the last few years, I would say a couple tools I'd like to shout out with, because that'll help me kind of give it some context. Digital adoption platforms are really something that it has over the last 5-10 years have been up and coming. And for, some of the stuff that I do is like systems training. And then some of the stuff that I do is other training that's not systems training, or sometimes it's a hybrid, But so I would say that, the digital adoption platform has been very interesting, and I had a chance to do a Walk Me project. And you can gather a lot of analytics by looking at what people are clicking on and taking those opportunities to gather those analytics and providing feedback. And that would be considered, an assessment, that type of situation. Another one I'd like to say, Exonify is an interesting upcoming tool where I do a lot of traditional screen simulations using like Articulate Storyline or Captivate. And, on those, you do the, show me, try me, test me, traditional. Well, Exonify is really cool because it captures like objects. And so when you do a recording, you can actually make changes to different objects, and they have a really neat scoring feature in there that allows you to put keywords in some of the text. You can collect text. That's always the biggest thing for me, is collecting text, and I'll get that more into that in that next question. And then also tools like Asima with gamification tools. That one's kind of neat. I'm sorry, I switched the tools. Asima is the one that has the cloning technology. Exonify is the one that is one that has gamification. So people are doing in the moment type of assessments on the job. And that's a lot of fun little one that'll pop up while you're working, and then you can do a little question and then you kind of go back to it. And so then you're able to kind of collect questions as you go along. But the stuff I'm working on the most passionately the last couple of years is a lot of LXP, learning experience platforms. And I've been working with Degreed, and I had another edX technology. And most recently in the last couple of years, Degreed integrated with CredSpark, which is an assessment tool that allows you to build assessments and surveys and integrate them in the learning experience platform. And that has been a huge game changer for design.
So I get the view there. There's a lot of new tools that have come on stream, if I can put it like that, in the last 5 years or so. Nathan, can I ask you the same question, but perhaps also put around the end of that? Are you now seeing those tools come into the mainstream and be used widely? Or is there still that issue that there's a lot coming on, but not a lot of it is actually being taken up across the board?
Yeah, there's types of tools are still new to the market, and comes with other tools like that too. There's been more AI and machine learning tools that have come out with Google TensorFlow, R packages, Python packages, and that sort of thing. But that still doesn't mean that those are used very heavily on the front lines. And I think that's one of the things that was in my list for this question was, the increased use of machine learning and AI has certainly exploded over the last 10 years as we've gotten more and more of these tools available, both commercial solutions as well as the free solutions that are out there. But they're still not easily, understood or applied. You're still going to need somebody that's a Python developer or whatever it is that you want to implement some of these tools for you. And I think one of the big advances has been remote proctoring, which should be no surprise to anybody that's in the assessment industry. 10 years ago, that was still brand spanking new. And now since the COVID pandemic hit, it's something that we take for granted in a lot of cases. But I think that field is still struggling to find their place. Well, not struggling is not the rest of the word, working to find their place. In terms of, where does AI fit in best in terms of remote proctoring versus human proctoring, how we blend those two to be most efficient and most effective, so that we're not using human all the time, and we can't use AI all the time either because it's not been shown to be as accurate as we want it to be. So there's still room for growth there too.
So Jeff, your take on it from that point of view, i.e. a lot has happened because of the pandemic, partly proctoring being one of the remote proctoring being one, but do you see the same issue, if you like, and it comes on to the next question to some extent, that there's an adoption pain, if you like, that hasn't been gone through for a lot of these things? If you look at the classroom at the far end or the assessment room at the far end, it wouldn't look much different from 5 or 10 years ago in most cases.
Yeah, I think it's obvious to everyone who's here at this conference and listening to getting these ideas. We're all trying to push that rock uphill, right? We all see that the change is needed, and where should we be teaching and how should we be teaching? And as Nathan just said, like how widespread is it? Not widespread enough. I also was going to talk about, COVID forcing the issue of the remote proctoring. I must say we're a tools company, so we're one of those tool providers. If you're using, Storyline and those types of tools, you should be looking at us and for your easy to use and assess the simulations. But that's where the exciting space for me comes, is going outside that box of what a standard assessment can be and starting to use games and other things and simulations, the doing, right? We want to capture the mental model of a student and be able to assess that at that moment in time. And that's not just rote memorization they can look up on Google anyway.
Okay, so that leads me to the next question. In fact, to kind of follow on from the point you've just made, which is the pain bit, the developing the tool or making that tool assess effectively. And that's, there's a next question says, what are the biggest struggles or pain points? And I guess that's one of them. So perhaps that one plus any others that you see that are obvious. And I'll go back, if I may, to start with Angela, and I'll come round again if I may.
Yeah, so I think currently in this moment in time, one of the biggest pain points, and maybe you guys have already talked about this in the conference, is SCORM files. Not capturing the kind of analytics that we need them to capture. And so a lot of people are kind of transitioning to, 10CAN API. But a lot of the, LMSs are not set up to receive that yet. And a lot of these corporations that I work with have maybe had the same LMS for 10 years and they have such a huge library on it, they really don't want to move to another LMS. So I'm often working with clients that have like Success Factors or Cornerstone or something like that. And they don't even really know how to configure it. Maybe there are those options available, but they're not sure how to even approach it, and how much money is it going to take for them to hire an expert to help them to get to the next level and where to start, So I think that some of these places are, turning to learning record store integrations. I'm starting to see some of that. And they're trying to do some sort of an integration so that they can use that API 10CAN. And then if we can get a way that they can get, more statistics using some of the tools that we're familiar with, and then seeing some more improvements on those tools, that would be fantastic. And then again, also the big thing for me is always, like, I always come into these assignments where they want to capture text, and there's just no good way to do that. It's multiple choice. It's, and we need them to do that. We need to look at these learners writing. How do they write? Because they're writing reports, and we need a way to measure that or put it in part of the test, put it in part of the assessment and attach images. It seems real simple, a simple ask, right? And to be able to maybe measure keywords. So those are the biggest things I'm seeing currently.
Okay, thanks, Angela. Nathan, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's certainly an issue in trying to make the statistics and the modern technologies available to more users and in usable formats or easily consumable formats. One of the questions that I deal with a lot is in the psychometric side. We've got cool technologies that have existed for 30, 40 years, like adaptive testing, item response theory, automated essay scoring, you name it. But a lot of those technologies are still only in the domain of these billion-dollar assessment engines or corporations, because in many cases, they're still being done by calling some Python code or something like that. They're not easily usable for, let's say, a small certification board or something like that. And that's one of the issues that I hear quite frequently. Another one is security, test security. That became big, of course, over COVID too, because you couldn't deliver exams in person anymore, and that shifted some towards remote proctoring. And now some organizations are trying to go back to in-person exams. Some are staying with remote proctoring. They're still trying to figure out what is the best practice for security and how to be able to maintain security in a cost-effective manner, which, I've seen some other organizations I work with just try to go into AI-only proctoring or looking at it or say, hey, we want to use our own proctors because they've got, board volunteers that they think can proctor an exam and keep it secure. But delivering a high-quality assessment with security and proctoring is harder than most people think. And there's work that has to go on in training them, being able to establish policies on board each examinee, that sort of thing. And that's certainly a pain point. How do you balance with be trying to be cost efficient with trying to maintain security and quality psychometrics.
Okay, and Jeff, picking up on that and perhaps extending it in this way, how much do you see organizations taking the view that, well, we invested X million 5-10 years ago, we don't really want to invest X million again now, that should last us for another 50 years, exaggeration perhaps, but you know, paper and pencil lasted us for 100 years, so we want this one to last for at least half of that, and therefore we're not prepared to invest, however good it looks, however effective it may be.
Yeah, I was actually going to talk about institutional inertia, which is really there. And I think it's interesting comparing what Angela's talking about in the corporate space and what's happening in education. And you certainly see that with institutions where the professors kind of run the show. And during COVID, a little bit of that blew up. But the bottom line is the professor doesn't want to change his course, right? So you invested money, but also it's time and effort. So he thinks or she thinks the course is fine. And here you are, you have, so I was going to say, to roll back a few minutes, right? The biggest barrier to entry, I think, for moving the ball forward is how do you get people when they're looking at those transitions, when they're looking at, okay, there's something else out there. You know, how do you get an organization, not just one person there who's the champion of it and is fighting the, you know, the dragon. But how do you get people to stop and think that, you know what, this isn't really working the way we want it to be, and therefore we should stop banging our heads against the wall. So if we spend all that money, sure, sorry, it's not getting us where we want necessarily. There's something better out there. How can, you know, whether it's a university or whether it's a company, you know, usually change comes about from an individual or a group of individuals, but it also can come about by something, an event like COVID, which exposes these shortcomings and hopefully would open people's eyes. But no one loses their job because they did with the same thing that they did last year. So.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess that in a sense leads to the next one, which or at least the one after next I'm going to go to first, which is a bit about saying about how the process of developing tools and so on could be improved, especially to ensure the ultimate benefits are for learners, obviously, but also to effectively say, not just this is a new toy that I've got here, I'd like you to buy it, please, in so many words, but actually this is fundamentally going to improve your outcomes, your bottom line in a corporate sense, perhaps, and so on, so that you've got that incentive to actually see people beginning to say, oh, perhaps we ought to do something about this. And can I pick it up from the corporate point of view, first of all, Angela, with yourself?
Yeah, so I would say that I think that the biggest miss here is that you have to think like the people that are the executives that are making these buying decisions, and what are the things that they're thinking about. You know, they're thinking about, you know, security, but they're also thinking about maintenance. Like, it's easy to bring in somebody like me for, you know, a contract for like a year, and then I can get everything rolling. But I think one of the biggest pain points that we're experiencing right now is how do they maintain it once they get it done? And so one of the things that the clients I work with struggle is, you know, how do they maintain it internally? Do they want to have this technology in-house through their server? Or do they want to have this technology on cloud? And that really will be like the make or break on it. And there are more moving of cloud subscriptions, but some of the ones that are more successful are like a cloud subscription where you can still maintain your content inside of your SharePoint, and it just works with your content in there. Or you can plug it into some sort of a technology that you already have. So those are the kind of decisions that you know, the executives and senior leaderships are looking at.
Okay, thanks. Nathan, moving that across perhaps into the education sector, how do you see the education sector being moved forward in this way? Sorry, Nathan, you got your mic off at the moment.
Sorry, it wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without somebody saying that. So like Jeff was saying earlier, it's certainly not coming from the professors or the instructors. The movement towards modern technology is coming from other directions, and then trying to deal with the integrations. In a lot of cases, it's somebody at the management perspective, somewhere in administration that says, hey, we need to get into doing online assessments, or we need to get into doing remote proctoring, or we need to use tech enhanced item types, or we need to use simulations and gamifications, or whatever it is. It's not necessarily someone at the instructor level or even at the exam administration level. It's usually somebody from the higher level. And I find that not to be the case even just in universities, but in other things like school districts or ministries of education. The Minister of Education or the Director of IT at a Ministry of Education, those are the ones that saying, hey, we should look into doing gamification. And how do we do that? And how do we integrate learning with assessment and complete the cycle for the students? And that then brings up some really large questions about, what is the path of the students throughout the school year, and what are the integrations that are needed to make that successful?
Yeah, okay, I can identify with the Ministry of Education bit. 10 years ago, perhaps even 15 years ago in the UK, in England, we were about to launch e-assessment for our major age 16 examination system. A minister elsewhere in the government resigned for reasons I won't go into. The one who wanted to do it moved, and the one who followed him didn't want anything to do with technology at all. So that was the end of it. And we're only just coming round to thinking about doing it again 15 years later.
Well, it really did rest on one person's shoulders.
Exactly. Okay, so Jeff, can you pick up on that? And perhaps also, could you pick up on the thought of there's a lot of development going on out there, and we've heard about a lot of it today and this afternoon. Is there any particular kind of key aspects of developments that really need to be thought about in terms of picking up learner outcomes, in terms of them improving their learning as well as getting assessed at the same time?
I think there was a few things that before I came on here, I wanted to make sure I talked about it. This could be a good opportunity to speak to that. There's an education process being championed at MIT called learning engineering, and it was started at Carnegie. And it sounds like a fancy term, but really all it's about is this concept of, like Lindsey was saying at the end there, like she wished she had done a little bit of development and then, had time to iterate more. And it's this concept of working with the stakeholders. So much of what we do is we do the research, we do the backward design, we get it right, and then we ship it off into the world. But there's not enough looking at that result. Now I'm speaking as a whole, not what this group does and what this group would like to do. And it's not always an easy thing to do, right? With IRBs, getting that data back and everything. But, is make your assessments into a living thing, and make sure, particularly for us, where we're doing workforce training stuff, are we going to be on target? We're going to need to have a plan in place to check in with people a year later, 3 years later. Like, did our tool get what you were needing you to do? Did it assess for the right things, right? So there's not enough. It's too much of a vendor consumer relationship right now. It's not enough partnership, like let's work together, because again, everyone's kind of over their head or being told, your job is to do this, or like you said, Martyn, one day it's one thing, so your whole team works in that direction, and then the next day it's something else. And of course, we all know that's not only frustrating, it's incredibly counterproductive, and as a whole, we're not moving forward. And that's that's kind of exciting about the learning engineering. You can go ahead and look it up. It's a very small group of people right now, high-powered heavy hitters, and they're just graduating some of their first students through BC and other schools. in this philosophy of a better way to build assessments and get to better outcomes.
Okay, so that leads me to it's kind of a little offshoot from that, and that is, how much do you see what I'll call buyer's regret out there when you've been working with either corporations or with K-12 or universities, whatever it may be, that effectively, you know, I have a pot of money, aha, that looks good, I'll use my pot of money, because if I don't use it, I won't have it again next year or whatever it may be. Do you see elements of that as you go around? Angela, can I start with you on that one?
Well, I think it depends on what it is that you're assessing. I mean, there's so many different, you know, how critical is the assessment, and what are you using the assessment for? Like, for example, I'm working on a project with compliance training. So the assessment could be looked at by the government and several different types of government institutions, not just the US, but international institutions. And so when we have to design our learning program, we have to take that into consideration, and what are they going to be looking for, and making sure that all of the learning objectives are aligned with what's going to be on the assessment, so that you can measure it, and what are the different ways that we can measure the learning. But, you know, these are different creatures than some of the other assessments that I've worked on over the years, where maybe a digital assessment, where we want to make sure that, you know, a learner is understanding like a software solution or something like that, or maybe it's an assessment so that we can do a demo of a product. And so those are so every single instance, every single one that I work with, they're all custom, and so they all have different problems and solutions.
Nathan, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I certainly haven't seen much of buyer's regret. It's usually in the other direction, I would say, of, you know, I wish I had bought this 10 years ago kind of thing, or I wish I invested in Apple in 1999. It's because I think a lot of it comes down to the kind of cases that you were talking about earlier, where there's just so much institutional inertia, like Jeff was saying, and that it takes them 10 years to get to doing something that they actually want to do, that somebody came up with 5 or 10 years ago. So, you know, I'll talk with organizations that work with us, and they're like, yeah, we've been meaning to move from paper to online assessment for 10 years. And we finally got around to it, you know, finally released an RFP, finally got a budget from the state, whatever it is. And those are the types of conversations that I more typically have. And then it's, in some cases, we've had, you know, things go the other direction. We actually had a situation like you just described, where we had a client that was trying to use our platform, and then something changed up on top, and they said they were going to go back to doing it the old way. And it's, you know, like Jeff was saying, nobody loses their job for doing the same thing that they did last year. And I think that's one thing that we're all fighting. You know, we're talking about technology and assessment right here. That's one of the biggest things when it comes to trying to work in technology, right?
Jeff?
Yeah, I think in the cases, I agree with Nathan, where when it goes right, they want it, you know, they wish they'd done it earlier. I will shoot a challenge shot across the bow for everyone here who's making stuff. This will resonate with them, but where buyer's regret often happens is where I always ask the two things. The two most important things are, you know, what are we trying to do here? And then who is it for? And that question, who is it for, means how is it going to be consumed? And too often people design a product that's out of sync with how it's going to be consumed. If you're designing a product that's going to be played on a laptop and the consumer is trying to play it on their phone in front of the TV or while they're doing laundry, that's not how it's going to, you're not going to have success there. Now, obviously, in the world of assessments, you're not doing laundry at the same time, the way that theoretically some of these credentialed courses are, you know, just watch these 15 videos and we'll give you a credential. That's different. But I would say still, you know, be careful, like Nathan said, like the remote proctoring services, they're not necessarily struggling, but they're in a transition period and trying to figure out that definition. So you can get some loses where you forget exactly realistically how things will be consumed, like how will it logistically play out.
Okay, so I've got no questions up on the screen now. If anybody's got out there has got any questions for our panel, please pop them up on the Q&A now, and we'll try and get them over to the panel for you. But in the meantime, I'm going to pick up on what is the kind of $64,000 question, as you might say, and that is, where do you see this going? Now, the original thinking was to say, where do you see your vision for an ideal assessment landscape in 50 years from now? I'm not so sure that that's not a bit too far away. I don't think 50 years ago we could have seen a lot of what we're doing now. So perhaps I'm going to bring that back a bit and say, what would you like to see in 10 years now? Not just in terms of the technology, but in terms also of approaches. And what are the one or two things, if there have been, that you've seen in the last couple of years, perhaps, that's made you think, well, yeah, if they get going in 10 years' time, they could be the big thing. What would you invest in thinking it might be the next Apple, for example, would be my question. And I'm going to start off with Nathan on this one and get your thoughts on that.
Sure. This one's not going to be a surprise to many of listeners today, but it's AI and machine learning. And for me, as a psychometrician, that has very specific meaning. It's talking about things like automated item generation, automated essay scoring, and adaptive testing. It's solving very specific problems in psychometrics and test development by using elements of AI and machine learning. In some cases, it has direct impact on the students. In other cases, it's just making the assessment development process more efficient. So that test developers, item writers, university instructors, whoever it is, have to spend less time in terms of developing exams and delivering them. So that's one thing I'd like to see happen. The problem is that we have to worry about balancing the advances in AI with the validation that's necessary when it comes to assessment. We have to make sure that we're not just applying AI willy-nilly, but being able to actually show that it works. An example of that is automated essay scoring. There's a lot of AI tools that are free in R, Python, or whatever that can be plugged in as long as you've got someone with development skills. But that doesn't mean it's a good idea to use those. There's a lot of work psychometrically that goes into applying automated essay scoring. And it's the models you use are different for each, not just each essay, but each prompt and each rubric that you're scoring with each essay. And you need somebody to be able to manage that process and ensure that you have a defensible scoring algorithm. So there's the push and pull there of validity with the advancements in AI, but I think that's something that I'd love to see fully mature.
And do you see that within the next 10 years? Or is that a bit too hopeful, or in fact, 10 years is too long?
Yeah, it's certainly going to advance in the next 10 years, but I think 10 years is not enough to fully productized and make it foolproof for easy usage by every university professor in the world, right? There's long ways for that.
Okay.
I mean, we're still struggling to get university professors using computerized testing, right? And that's been around for 40 years.
Yeah. Okay, Jeff, your thoughts on this one?
Well, I think there's a saying that as humans, we tend to underestimate the progress that will be made in the next 3 to 5 years. So we find ourselves surprised, but then we overestimate what will happen in the next 10 years. That being said, I do think that some of this transition, so I started in the 90s in the gaming industry, and there's no one in administration who was in the gaming industry. And it wasn't, the gaming industry today is run by the kids, and they came up with those games and with that technology, and they trust it and they're comfortable. So our marketing people used to be executives who knew magazines and Frito-Lay, and nowadays that's not the case at all. So to Nathan's point, like some of that transition, I think is going to have to be at an institutional level. to open their eyes to adopting, so you're having larger adoptions at scale. But to me, I agree about the AI automated scale. I feel that where we're excited about is, not so much about education and degrees, but the workforce skills transition and credentialing skills and it becoming more of a skills marketplace. And I'll be curious to hear Angela's opinion if she's seeing pressure in the workforce training. The story that we're kind of hearing is, colleges aren't teaching the critical thinking and leadership and empathy. And we know that since No Child Left Behind has created a crunch and standardized tests and everyone just has to be assessed all the time, the kids, where are they supposed to get their social emotional skills from, right? So no wonder they don't know how to talk to each other when they get into companies. So I feel like simulations like the ones we're working on or trying to do, and again, maybe by 10 years we'll have it right. This idea of creating complex mental models that really reflect what the student is thinking at that point in time beyond multiple choice and putting them in a real world environment where they're doing stuff, right? It's that higher level classroom type of thing where then if they make mistakes, you can correct the behavior. I know an assessment, again, you might not do that in the assessment. You might just note where they're failing, right? But it's that ability to be willing to experiment, to push technology, to try to capture more complex thoughts than just a math test, or hard skills like flying. The first simulators did a great job with flying. But what's the flying equivalent of running a company, right? What do you need from your employees and how can you simulate that? How can you assess that? And I think there's going to be some exciting strides in the next 3 to 5 years, and hopefully we'll get it right by the next 10.
So, Angela, I think there's a question there for you to answer, and perhaps I can add a little bit to it, which is to say, are there things that you can see in the corporate sphere, if I could use that terminology, which you can see should be coming to education in the next 5 to 10 years? Perhaps would be a way of putting it.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I think that right now, the trend in HRs, like I said, well, LXPs are the hot thing right now. A lot of the HRs are getting these learning experience platforms. And what's really nice about them is that they integrate really well with your, your LMS. But you can use that to do employee development. And so what they do is, and one of the things that we're doing in this learning rollout I'm involved in right now is we attach skills through tagging on the different, learning assets that we develop and we add to the catalog. So then when they try to encourage for career development, for learners to come in and they do like a skills test in the beginning. And then it uses our AI technology to present, this is some recommended learning for you. And then as you're going along, you're trying to fill kind of like the buckets that you would need to get to the next level. And this makes it really easy for maybe your supervisor to do an assessment, your annual assessment, to see what you've done to go to the next level education-wise, as well as your performance. Or maybe they can use that to assign you trainings. They can say, here's some gaps, and this is what we want you to look at, and we want you to learn this. And so, and then there's also opportunities for people that are going to want to just go out and they want to teach themselves. Maybe they're interested in a subject and they can have these opportunities. So their main message that we would want to give to our corporations is to provide these learners a little bit of time every day so that they can work on that. And that's one of the things they get these great tools, and here you are, have at it, but then they don't give them enough time on their schedule to actually, so then they're not motivated because they want to leave work. They don't want to spend their spare time working on that, but some people do anyways. They find the time and they do it, I guess it just depends.
Okay, well, I'm going to wrap it up at that point. We're about 4 minutes away from our deadline, so I think we've done well. Unless you've got any final points to make, can I thank all of you for your time? Some very interesting discussions there, some very interesting points being made, and thanks again for your time and your contributions. Jeff, handing back to you.
Thank you, Martyn. Having two Jeffs on the screen is confusing. I do appreciate that. But thanks a lot. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, Nathan. Thanks, Angie. And many thanks, Martyn. A fascinating session. I can't believe how much ground we covered, or you covered, within that. And it does actually nicely set up for some of our sessions tomorrow, particularly our keynote in the afternoon from Daniel Jarrett. But it's themes that we'll see, I think, picked up over the next couple of days really, really well. So time for me to bid everybody a good night, or whatever time of day it is at your place. Thank you all for sticking with us and attending through today. I hope you enjoyed it nearly as much as I did, because I thought it was fascinating. And I look forward to tomorrow. Join us again tomorrow. You have a different link to click on for tomorrow, but that's the day 2 link in the various emails that you've had today. And I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow for another great day. Many thanks, everybody, and safe journey home, as they say, if you were not at home for today. Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye.